Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and in this video I want to introduce you to the new things that we can do with scroll views in iOS 17. There are a lot of new modifiers and methods to cover, but we should get through them quite quickly. In the first part we're going to cover ContentMargins, ScrollIndicatorsFlash, DefaultScrollAnchors, and the ScrollClipped disabled property. Next we'll move on and I'll show you all about scroll targets and ScrollTargetBehaviour, and the new ContainerRelativeFrame modifier, and then we can programmatically set our scroll position. And then finally, we're going to finish off by looking at that fabulous new scroll transition made possible by iOS 17. Lots of exciting new things to make your apps pop with excitement. Before I get on with the content, I want to introduce you to Brilliant, who are sponsoring this video. I couldn't have asked for a better sponsorship because Brilliant, like me, are in the business of trying to help you reach your goals in ways that work for you. Brilliant has over 100 course offerings in math, data science, and computer science, and presents content interactively. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that no one source can teach you everything, and many times presenters like me might assume that you know more than what you do about the topics that we're covering. Well, whatever your skill level, Brilliant will customize content to fit your needs with guided lessons and helpful hints in a fun and an interactive way. Now, there's more to learning and being proficient in coding and becoming a software engineer than just learning how to code in Swift to build your apps. Let Brilliant help you fill in the missing pieces and provide you with a solid background in topics that'll help you solve real-world problems not only right away, but it'll lay the groundwork for learning more in-depth topics in the future. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer free for 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/StuartLynch or by clicking on the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. I have a starter app for this video, and I encourage you to download it from the link in the description. Once completed, you'll have a resource that you can refer back to in the future when you want to implement the new powers of ScrollView introduced in iOS 17. This video will be broken into 3 parts, and I have 3 different SwiftUI views for this. Each of these 3 views are embedded in a tab view here should you wish to run this on the simulator and simply select the tab for each corresponding part. We'll not need to run it in the simulator here because all of this will be visible in our previews. In this first part, I've used a form to focus on what it is that I want to show. Currently, the only difference between the different horizontal scroll views are the colors, and in each case there are 9 colored rectangles displayed in a scroll view with a horizontal axis. To create these views, I created a new view called the hScrollContent, where I pass in the color and the number of items that is bound to a state property on my view. You can also see that I have a shadow radius property and that the default value is nil, but I'll get to that later. The view simply creates an H-stack with rectangles sized to a frame of 50 by 50 and a fill using the color specified with a gradient applied. And then an overlay displays the number of the rectangle as we step through from 1 up to the number of items, which is originally up till 9. In this first red scroll view, I want to introduce you to a new simplification of a modifier that is unrelated to scroll views. We can clip the shape of our content here by applying a clip shape modifier to it. And prior to iOS 17, we had to do this. We had to apply a clip shape and then specify the full view that we want to clip. For example, a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 10. And now we see both of the edges are clipped with a rounded corner. Well, in iOS 17, there is a new clip shape static function that we can apply, and one like .rect will allow me to enter the corner radius directly, and it will apply that rounded rectangle with that corner radius. So similar to the rounded rectangle, there are shortcuts now for other clip shapes that we might want to apply, such as ellipse. Now if I apply a border to this scroll view like this with a border of red, we'll see that our scroll view is right up against the top and bottom edges of the enclosing frame. This is not particularly good because we see that the scroll indicators are inside that frame. Well, prior to iOS 17, we solved this by adding horizontal padding to move the scroll view inside the outside boundaries and a bottom padding to provide space for the scroll bar itself. So let's apply a bottom padding of 10. And now I can remove the frame and see that this actually looks better. The scroll indicators aren't encroaching on our view. Well, in this next section now, I'm going to show you a different way to do this, and it was introduced in iOS 17. But before I do so, however, notice that there is an action in that toolbar button that increases the number of rectangles each time we tap on it. Now the problem is when I do that, I don't see much of an indication anywhere that anything has happened. In iOS 17, a new modifier was introduced that allows you to flash the scroll indicators when something changes. So we can watch for changes using the ScrollIndicatorsFlash method, where the trigger is our num items. Now there is a ScrollIndicatorsFlash on appear method as well that for some reason I can't get to work with a horizontal scroll view. This may just be a beta bug, but I'll show you it later in a vertical scroll view. So now when we add a new item, we clearly see the scroll indicators flash, so we know that something has changed and is encouraging us to scroll. Moving on now to the next example then, let's see how we can deal with those padding differently now. In iOS 17, a new contents margin modifier has been introduced, and that's ContentMargins. We use this modifier to customize the content margins of different kinds of views. So for example, we can use the modifier to customize the margins of a scroll view. Views don't have to be just a plain scroll view, they can also be applied to all views that are scrollable, like a text editor. So first let's add a green border here so we can clearly see the difference. Unlike padding where we added it to the content, with content margins we add it to the scroll view itself. And unlike padding, where I want to just add a horizontal spacing, here I actually have to specify an actual value that I want. And we'll make sure that the placement here is set to for scroll content. We'll see the other option later. And then to provide spacing for the scroll interviews on the bottom, we can specify content margins for the bottom of 10 for our scroll content. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at directing the scroll position programmatically, but there is another new modifier that will allow us to specify an anchor position for our scroll view when it first appears. So in this blue scroll view section here, let's apply some content margins like above for the bottom. But we can now also apply a default scroll anchor and provide an anchor point, and we see that we have all of the options for a scroll view that can have both horizontal and vertical axes. Let me just specify center. Note that this just specifies the anchor point when the view first appears. We can't apply this programmatically after the fact. For that, we have to do something else, as we'll see in the next section. For the last example in this section, I want to apply some shadow around our rectangles. Remember, I said that we had additional optional shadow property for that view. So let me add a shadow radius of 5. Let me also hide the scroll indicators here using that scroll indicators method by choosing hidden for the visibility. Well, this isn't looking particularly good. Well, what I could do is add some content margins of 5 on all sides, like this, for our scroll content. But this changes the frame of our view, and that might not be what we want. So I'm going to comment this out. Now, in iOS 17, we can simply apply a ScrollClipped disabled modifier to our scroll view. And we see that the frame for our scroll view is still the same, and especially if we add a red border around it, we see that the shadow now extends beyond the frame. In part 2 here, you see that I have two horizontal scroll views that are displaying a number of images that I've uploaded to the assets folder for this project. These are all my photos, so no attribution is necessary. Now I've also created an image asset struct that's an identifiable object where I use a unique int for the ID, and the name is simply the name of the asset that's in my asset catalog. There is also a static property that creates an array called all, that is all of my assets, each one with that unique ID. And there's also another static function that will allow me to retrieve the asset name based on the ID provided. Now, in both cases, the scroll view displays each of the images in the H stack where they are all resized, scaled to fit, and set to a frame of 300 by 225. And then in the second one, I've got a couple of buttons and a text view that we'll get to shortly. Well, right now, as you see, when we scroll, our images pretty much stop anywhere, and we can't control that. We often get left with partial images. First, let me add some horizontal content margins and hide the scroll indicators here. In iOS 17, we now have a scroll target behavior, and we have two options, paging and view aligned. Now, a scrollable view calculates where scroll gesture should end using its deceleration rate and the state of its scroll gesture by default. And a scroll behavior allows for customizing this logic. And you can provide your own scroll target behavior or use one of the built-in behaviors provided by SwiftUI. So that's what we'll be looking at. In the first case, then, we'll apply a scroll target behavior of and choose paging. Well, this behavior uses the geometry of the scroll view to decide where to allow scrolling to end. And to be honest, how it figures this out baffles me, and I'm not sure how much better this is than the original. Perhaps I'm missing something here, but this is what it is. And if someone can tell me the benefit of this, please leave me a comment, as my images are still getting cut off. On the other hand, the other scroll target behavior is much better, and that's the scroll aligned. So first, let's add those same content margin and the remove scroll indicators, and I'm going to change the scroll target behavior to view aligned. This doesn't do anything though, unless we also specify a scroll target layout. So we need something for this view to get aligned to. And in our case, we're going to apply the scroll target layout to our H stack. And now when I swipe, it always gets aligned, and I'm always seeing a full image in view. Now, another view modifier that was added, and that is the ContainerRelativeFrame modifier. We use this modifier to position a view within an invisible frame with a size relative to the nearest container. If we use this for our image here, it will size itself relative to the H stack. So instead of using this fixed frame here, I'm going to change it to ContainerRelativeFrame on the horizontal axis. Now our image is centered nicely, and our content margins are showing partial pieces on either side. As I swipe, it always centers itself. That's nice. Well, also added to iOS 17 is the new way to determine scroll position. Since our image assets all have an ID, we can use this to determine the position of the current image in the scroll view, and then use that to display the image name in this text field. So first, let me start by creating a state property to hold the scroll ID. And we know that our ID is an int, so we'll specify it as an int and make it optional, because we haven't done any scrolling when the view loads. And now we can apply a scroll position modifier to our scroll view that will be bound to that property. And that's the ID of the image being scrolled, or the content being scrolled. Well, now that we have that, as we scroll, this ID is set to that image asset's ID. And remember, I have a function that will fetch the name of our image based on that ID used. So I should then be able to replace the text field with the name fetched by that static image asset name function. However, because it's optional, I'll also want to use an if-let here first to unwrap the scroll ID before presenting the text view with the name resulting from that function call. Well, this doesn't look right at first, but as I swipe, I see the name changes. And then the reason why it's not working at first is because on load, scroll ID is nil. So what we'll need to do is to create an onAppear block that checks first to see if our image asset.all, our entire array, is empty. And if not, we can assign the first item in that array ID to the scroll ID. This method will also allow us to programmatically jump to any of our items so long as we can provide an ID. So for our buttons, we can use this same function to go to the first item view and use that in our first button's action. And then we can do something similar for the last one too, but instead of 0, we can pass in the image assets all's count -1. Now, tapping on the button, we jump to that position, either the first or the last. Well, we can make this even better by enclosing each one within an animation block. Now I'm going to come back to this view shortly after I finish the final part, but I want to show you a couple more things first. Before I move on to showing you new transitions, let's take a look at this scroll indicator. It's actually starting within the navigation bar, not the visible scroll view. Well, what we can do now is use that other option for the content margins. So we'll apply a content margins where the top is set at 40, but this time we'll apply it to the scroll indicators. Now we see the scroll indicator starts at the top of our first image within the view. The scroll indicators, however, are still right up against the view, so instead now of applying some padding to the image, we can apply another content margin for the trailing side, specified at 10, but specify that the scroll content is what we want it to be applied to this time. Well, now on to some more exciting stuff. In this view, I'm displaying those same images now, though, but in a vertical scroll view. And there's no need for an H-stack. I can just loop through each of these items here. Now, what's wonderful about iOS 16 is a new scroll transition method. When we scroll our view, the items go through a phase change. When they're fully in view, within the view, we say that they are in the identity phase. If we apply a scroll transition method to the items within the scroll content, we can choose the default constructor and tap Enter. And this gives us a closure that provides us with something that's called an empty visual effect that we'll just call content, and it's really our view, with no effect applied. And a scroll transition phase that we can just call phase. So if using this closure now, we just specify content, nothing's going to change. We haven't applied any changes to our actual content. However, now that we have this phase, I mentioned that there is an identity property, and it has an isIdentity attribute that is true if it's fully in view and false if not. So for example, we can apply an opacity where we can specify a condition based on phase isIdentity and specify 1 if it is, or 0.3 if not. Now you see it fades out of view at the top and into view at the bottom. Well, you can get quite creative here by applying multiple effects. So why don't we try a scale effect? And again, we'll use the phase identity as our condition. If it's true, we'll specify it at 1.0. If it's false, 0.3. This is a really nice effect now to see as we're scrolling. We see that the images either diminish or increase depending on whether or not they're leaving or entering the view. Now, before I jump back to my last view, let me show you how we can flash the scroll indicators when this vertical scroll view appears. All we have to do is apply the ScrollIndicatorsFlash onAppear method and specify it to be true. Now, each time the view appears, like when we enter the tab view, the scroll indicator will just flash and appear shortly and then disappear. So now let's go back to our previous view and apply a scroll transition to that horizontal scroll view we were working on last. I want to create a carousel effect using a 3D rotation effect. Now, besides the phase.identity property, there's also a phase value property. And the phase value is either a -1, a 0, or a 1. So when we're transitioning on or off the screen, when scrolling to the top or leading edge, that value is -1. If the image or the view is on the screen, it's 0. And if it's at the bottom or trailing edge, it's a +1. So let me apply a scroll transition here so that we can get our content and our phase and specify our content that we can apply those transitions to, or those effects to. So if we apply a rotation 3D effect here, we can specify that our angles will use degrees and then alter the angle based on the phase value. So we want it to be 0 or no actual rotation when we're in view. We want it to be 30 degrees rotated at the leading edge and -30 at the trailing edge. Well, this can be accomplished simply by multiplying our phase value by -30. So when it's at the top leading edge, -30 times -1 will give me 30 degrees. When it's in view, the rotation will be 30 times 0, so no rotation, no angle. And then when we're at the bottom or trailing edge, it's going to be -30 times 1, so -30 at that edge. And we want this only to be rotated along the y-axis so that we can set our x and z or z-axes to 0 and the y to 1. I'm going to add one more effect by setting the opacity based on, this time, phase identity, where it will be 1 when in view or 0.3 when out of view. This is a pretty nice effect, but I'm sure that those of you who are better at geometry and animation than I am can create much more exciting effects. But I still think this is pretty cool. Anyway, I hope you've learned something here that you'll be able to use in your own projects. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Make sure also that you subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to get notifications of new content as it gets published. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. Thanks for watching.